The Wehrmacht, 18 million men under arms, commanded by Adolf Hitler. This army will march into Europe and wage the bloodiest war in history. What sort of an army was it? Obedient followers of Hitler, or millions of manipulated young men? Young men trained and sent to the front. 1 in 3 will perish. Hitler's officers and generals, status-conscious military professionals, most of them non-political. Some of them were thoughtful men. Many were spineless careerists. Did they all share Hitler's goals? What part did they play in the crimes committed in the name of the German people? Ordinary soldiers who put their lives on the line, privates, non-commissioned officers. What did they feel? What did they believe in when they went to war?
Everyone said, man, you want to be a part of that. Everyone wanted to be a little hero.
Today we look at it a little more critically, the job of a soldier. But at that time, a young man was happy to find work anywhere.
I shot at him without thinking and realized that in my very first action, I'd killed a man. It still haunts me today.
We didn't think about it. We were a big group, and we just hung together.
We ate our bread, or ladled out our meals, sitting next to our dead comrades, you see. And we just kept hoping that we'd get through it.
It was the feeling I had to swap my conscience for my duty, to obey orders. Today I'd call it mindless obedience.
A piece of our lives was stolen from us. There's no other way to put it.
At first, the Wehrmacht seems invincible. German soldiers are victorious in almost every battle. Battles that cause the deaths of millions, first of the enemy, then increasingly Germans too. What made this army so destructive? In military terms, Hitler was an amateur, yet he made himself commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In a series of ruthless power struggles, he gained absolute authority, and he made the Wehrmacht his tool. Recent research has uncovered new sources that give us a clearer picture of Hitler's Wehrmacht than ever before. The files give new answers to old questions. They illustrate how little separated good and evil. They reveal in a horrific way how people were abused and manipulated. And they show how many refused to heed their conscience. Newly discovered records offer a unique glimpse into the world of the German military elite. British Secret Service files. They were discovered and evaluated by historian Sönke Neitzel. Until recently, these documents were still top secret. Tens of thousands of pages on which secretly recorded conversations are transcribed. The conversations of leading generals of the Wehrmacht. This is where it happened. The idyllic country estate of Trent Park near London. This is where all the German generals who fell into the hands of the Western Allies were held.
The German generals were taken prisoner, in some cases in the middle of battle, and then they came to the peace and quiet of this beautiful estate, where they were provided with every comfort. And there they sat, condemned to idleness. And this idleness had its consequences. They talked. They talked to one another. They exchanged ideas about the war, about war crimes, about politics, and about the future. And what was special about this situation is that the British recorded these conversations on disc. And what makes this source so valuable is that they were private conversations. And in these conversations, no one was respectful of superiors, families, wives. In these conversations between colleagues, the unvarnished truth was told. And so we get to know the generals intimately, what they thought about.
Without realizing it, the captured generals gave away their real opinions about the war and the Nazis.
World history will concede one point to the Führer, that he recognized this great Jewish danger for the whole of mankind. Once it was Genghis Khan, or Attila the Hun. This time it's Jewish Bolshevism. We in our tiny West European countries have been so short-sighted. We were always bickering with each other over petty issues. We simply failed to understand what was threatening us from the East. In this, the Führer was absolute.
But what he did was stupid.
We were the stupid ones. The countries of Western Europe refused to join us, those idiots, and we suddenly found ourselves fighting on two fronts.
And doing the dirty work for the Western world.
Few Wehrmacht soldiers are completely free of anti-Semitism and nationalism. They're children of their times. They don't realize they're witnessing the beginning of the greatest disaster the world has ever seen. They even regard Hitler as a man of peace.
Hitler said over and over again he'd lived through the First World War, he'd been badly wounded and so on. So everyone was convinced that he would not start another war. And I have to add that during the campaign in Poland, we believed that the Poles and their delusions of grandeur were responsible for the war.
Dass die Polen in ihrem Größenwahnsinn die Kriegsschuld hätten.
That's what Heinrich Husmann has learned from the propaganda. He's with the 5th Panzer Division based in Upper Silesia in the summer of 1939. On September the 1st, the tanks crossed the border into Poland. It's the start of World War II. The older soldiers have mixed feelings, but the young are consumed by Hitler's ideas. Walter Heinlein is 20 years old.
I was excited. I wanted to be a soldier. No one could guess how it would turn out later. I was excited. Thank God we're finally moving. I hope we're not too late.
On this first day of the war, Adolf Hitler addresses a jubilant German parliament. He makes a blatant threat.
Just as I myself am prepared at any time to risk my life, anyone can take my life as long as it's for my people and for Germany. So I demand the same of everyone else. Whoever believes he can defy this national duty directly or indirectly will fall. Traitors can expect nothing but death. In saying this, we are simply committing ourselves to our old principle. It is of no importance if we live, but it is essential that our people lives, that Germany lives.
The soldiers are not prepared for the horrors of war. The Wehrmacht is far superior to the defending Polish forces. Even so, the ugly reality comes as a shock. But the men can't give vent to their feelings.
On September the 2nd, we had our first casualties. 2 men in our company were killed in the attack on Pless. The Poles had a line of bunkers there, and we were supposed to take these bunkers, where they had heavy machine guns, small cannon. We were supposed to take them, I almost said, with our bare hands. We couldn't do it.
Approximately 1.8 million Wehrmacht soldiers have been mobilized. They're going to war under the command of the generals. Men like Infantry General Johannes Blaskowitz, the son of a pastor from East Prussia. His mother died when he was still a baby. He was raised in military academies, the elite establishments of the Prussian aristocracy. Here he's trained for the life of an officer, the toughest education in the entire Reich. In exchange, a penniless young man gains entry to a privileged world. A uniform makes you something superior. Officers are treated with the highest respect. They receive the best service in restaurants, and the best tickets are reserved for them at the theater. In World War I, a formative experience for most Wehrmacht generals, Blaskowitz makes rapid progress. At 33, he's appointed to staff headquarters. But then comes the defeat of 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles, a humiliating blow. The German army is cut to 100,000 men. The generals want only one thing: the return of their former power. Johannes Blaskowitz, now a colonel, is accepted into the new army, but he's given administrative duties. For the time being, there's no hope of career advancement. Unknown to him, the military office in Berlin and undercover general staff is already planning rearmament. Karl Dirks, himself a World War II veteran, has written a book arguing that the army leadership wanted massive rearmament.
This
rearmament had been planned since 1923, after the occupation of the Ruhr by the French. At that time, the whole process was simply called a patriotic task. Then General von Seeckt was given emergency powers under paragraph 48 of the Constitution. He no longer had to ask anyone if he was allowed to plan it or not.
Hans von Seeckt, head of the army, is the driving force behind rearmament. It must be kept secret, for the planning alone is a violation of the peace treaty. In reality, Seeckt is planning for war.
What will the General Staff need in case of emergency? With that in mind, they calculated the necessary divisions and their equipment, and then they tweaked the plan so that it could be put into effect at a moment's notice. That was the purpose of the plan. It was actually a blueprint for the necessary materiel, finances and personnel. They finally settled on a figure of 3.75 million soldiers.
When Hitler comes to power in 1933, plans for the deployment of the Wehrmacht are ready. Karl Dirks has shown that the Wehrmacht of 102 divisions, with which Hitler begins World War II, corresponds exactly to the blueprint of the generals. Everything is ready for Hitler. Rearmament now moves ahead at top speed. The effects can be felt in everyday life.
All at once, everyone was wearing a uniform. Within 8 months, everyone was. There were people, public officials who were employed at government agencies and were civil servants. Close to us in Doormansweg, there was a man who always looked up and greeted us. We lived on the 4th floor then, in the Fruchtallee, and whenever we were sitting at the window, he took off his hat and greeted us. And 4 weeks later, he came by in uniform with a saber and did this. And I said, "Look, Herr so-and-so is already in uniform." And my father said, "Soon the postman will be wearing a sword."
I swear by God this solemn oath
That I will always serve the Führer of the German people and Reich, Adolf Hitler. That I will always be ready to lay down my life for this oath. I took it to heart. I really meant it.
From 1934 on, millions of manipulated young men had to swear allegiance directly to Hitler, a man who is planning a war of conquest. The idea came from the Wehrmacht leadership itself, Some of the generals hope that by this overt act of loyalty, they will preserve the military's independence. They're wrong. The Minister of War, Werner von Blomberg, is the first to suffer the consequences. In 1938, Blomberg is dismissed for marrying a former prostitute. Hitler himself was best man at the wedding. He feels he's been deceived. He exploits the situation for his next move. There's only one man he can trust to take charge of the Wehrmacht: himself. General Wilhelm Keitel, in charge of the newly created OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, reports directly to Hitler. Franz Halder becomes Chief of Staff of the Army High Command. The two organizations become permanent rivals, ideal conditions for Hitler's intrigues. Panzer General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma knows the Army High Command well. In November 1942, he's captured by General Montgomery in North Africa and greeted with a handshake. The British are experts in dealing with high-ranking prisoners. First, they question them and keep them in basic accommodation, the same treatment given to an ordinary soldier. After they've suffered these disagreeable conditions for a while, they're taken to the more salubrious surroundings of Trent Park. The idea is they'll feel comfortable here and converse freely with one another, not suspecting their every word is recorded by the microphones of the British Secret Service. It works. Thomas speaks quite openly about the army's leadership.
I tell you, don't expect anything from the general staff. 99% of them are completely spineless. They have always been servile. They were never commanders. They were more like assistants. Which is why most of them have no backbone. It's their upbringing, of course. You can't expect anything else.
Hitler is mistrustful of his generals too, since he hasn't got them completely under his control. But he knows how to get his way. The generals are no match for him. Colonel Karl-Heinz Frieser is a military historian in today's German army.
It ended up as a modus vivendi, an unholy alliance. Each needed the other. Hitler needed this reactionary military class to fight his war. For the generals, Hitler was the man who not only created new divisions, but also appointed new divisional commanders.
Like Hitler, the generals want to win back what the Germans lost in the First World War. But Hitler wants more. He wants to enslave the Slav peoples and to create Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Poland will become the first victim.
There were only negative opinions about Poland: lazy, dirty, old-fashioned and ugly. Anything that was unfashionable was Polish, and if something was dirty, that was Polish too.
Poland was depicted as the evil enemy. The whole thing was only supposed to last about 2 or 3 weeks, and then the war would be over. That's what they told us.
Old prejudice and new belligerency fanned the flames against Poland. Johannes Blaskowitz is one of the generals in charge of the invasion. A few days before the start of hostilities, he issues a command.
Soldiers of the 8th Army. From today, the 8th Army is established, the command of which has been entrusted to me by the Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht.
Our duty is to execute his will with hard, fast, forceful strikes. Long live the Führer.
The Polish campaign is a war between unequal opponents. The Poles put up fierce resistance, but in the end they can only wait in vain for the help of the Allies. Just 3.5 weeks after the outbreak of war, Błaszkowicz accepts the Polish surrender on a bus in Warsaw. Hitler's plans seem to be working. He presents himself as victor to the Poles and to his own generals. This commander-in-chief can advance their careers. Soon after the victory parade, General Błaszkowicz is awarded the Knight's Cross. He becomes head of the German occupation forces in Poland with the title Commander-in-Chief of the East. He's still a loyal, hard-working general in Hitler's Wehrmacht. But he slowly begins to have misgivings. This war is different from previous ones. In the area under his command, Jews are being harassed, pressed into forced labor, abused, and even shot. The generals only talk about it behind closed doors. It's the SS, not the Wehrmacht, that are carrying out the deliberate mass murders in Poland. But the overall head of occupying forces is Błaszkowicz, a Wehrmacht general. After several months, he issues a statement. Only later is it apparent that many officers and generals have been disturbed by the events in Poland. Edwin Count von Rotkirch is a 50-year-old colonel in a cavalry regiment. He has a hobby, making amateur films with his 8mm camera. He also likes appearing in his films. Later, as a prisoner of war, he recalls a disagreeable situation. Only now does he dare to speak about it.
I was in Kutno. I went there to film. I make films, that's all I do. I knew an SS officer there quite well, and we were talking about this and that, and then he said, "Do you feel like filming an execution?" I said, "No. I find that too disgusting." He said, "Well, it doesn't make any difference. We always shoot people in the morning anyway. But if you prefer, we still have a few left. We could also shoot them in the afternoon." You can't simply imagine how these men, they've become animals.
September the 4th, 1939, Częstochow in southern Poland, the 4th day of the war. For some unexplained reason, wild shooting breaks out shortly after German infantry enter the town. 8 German soldiers are killed and 14 wounded. The Germans retaliate in the most brutal fashion. Thousands of civilians are rounded up. At least 100 people are murdered, many of them Jews. Thus, from the opening days of the war, Wehrmacht units, some under Błaszkowicz's command, have participated in atrocities. In this case, the original shooting seems to have been friendly fire. Nervous German soldiers shooting at their own comrades. It was nothing unusual for their nerves to get the better of young soldiers.
If you have a weapon in your hand, then your hands tremble. You don't know what you're doing anymore. You run through the area and don't know where you're going. And in that situation, you're happy if someone comes and says, "Soldier, get down," or "take cover," because then you're out of sight, out of the line of fire.
Nervous soldiers and aggressive Nazi ideology. A potent mix. Private Heinrich Hussmann records his experiences in his diary.
September 10th, 1939, Opatov, Jews' paradise. I believe at least 85% of the inhabitants are Jews, and that's what it looks like. A terrible stench everywhere. And the Jewish shops are worst of all. They demand outrageous prices. We wouldn't dream of giving these vermin so much money.
Anti-Semitism was not rare in the Wehrmacht, but other soldiers are much less prejudiced.
We were in a small village, and along came a young lady, maybe 25 or 30, and she asked me, I was a sergeant then, I think, and she asked me, tell me, do we have to fear for our lives? And I realized that she was probably a Jew. I said to her, well, as far as I know, you don't need to be afraid. A year later, or months later, I would have said, just get out of here.
General von Rothkirch feels partly responsible for the atrocities he witnessed in Poland.
Just look how savage we have become ourselves. I drove through a small Polish village. They were shooting students there, just because they were students. And Polish aristocrats and landowners too. They were shooting everyone. I went to General Bockelberg and told him about it. He just said, now listen to me. It has to be done. There is no other way. The students are the most dangerous of all. They all have to go. And the aristocrats, they're always going to make trouble. And don't get yourself so horribly worked up. If we win the war, it won't matter. I said, Herr Generaloberst, that may be. But first of all, I will have to get used to these new principles.
But he didn't protest. Not so General Blaskowitz, a devout Christian. He's genuinely horrified by the systematic murders the SS task forces have been carrying out. Though he ignores the actions of his own units, he criticizes the misdeeds of the SS and the police in 2 memos to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Walter von Brauchitsch.
The Army refuses to be linked with the atrocities of the security police and refuses to work with the SS task forces, which function almost exclusively as execution units. The police have so far only spread terror among the population. To what degree the police are able to come to terms with the fact that they are forcing their own people to take part in this murderous frenzy cannot be judged from here. It is impossible to establish security and peace in this territory with violent measures alone.
Hitler is outraged and Blaskowitz is dismissed. However, only a few months later, he's given a new post in the West. The transcripts from Trent Park reveal that his fellow generals knew the background to his dismissal and did nothing.
We shot people. It started in Poland as early as '39. Apparently, the SS really cleaned up around there.
That's probably why they dismissed Blaskowitz.
Yes, of course. And the SS people were promoted instead of being shot.
Shortly after victory in Poland, Hitler reveals his next plan to the generals. He intends to attack France as soon as possible. Most of his generals believe it can't be done. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wants to talk Hitler out of it. He considers it the idea of a madman, but still he wavers. Christian Hartmann, a historian at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, has researched Halder's life and his relations with Hitler.
Halder was the great hesitator, the procrastinator. But it wasn't just a psychological characteristic with him, but a form of intellectual calculation too. As a member of the General Staff, he was used to working with several options, and you could describe him as someone who always had a number of fallback plans. And I think that actually expresses Halder's role very well, a man who wanted to keep all his options open.
The date for the war in the West is postponed again and again. Could this give Halder his chance? For weeks, according to a confidant, Halder went to see Hitler with a pistol in his pocket in order to shoot him.
The crucial point is that Halder never fired that shot at Hitler. We know there were many times they disagreed, not only in 38-39, but also in the summer of 1941 and in 1942. So it's a very ambivalent relationship. But in the end, the assassination did not happen, and that's all that matters.
In November 1939, Halder witnesses Hitler in a fit of rage, railing against the cowardliness and ineptitude of the generals. Halder now believes he has been betrayed and resigns himself to remaining silent. A contemporary described the Chief of Staff thus: Halder is like a balloon man, strong and brave when someone pumps him up, floppy and hollow when deflated. Meanwhile, in Koblenz, on the banks of the Rhine, in the Prince Bishop's palace now taken over by the army, a rival of Halder is planning the campaign against France. General Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff of the newly formed Army Group A. Together with Panzer General Heinz Guderian, Manstein has developed a totally new concept. He doesn't think in fixed positions like First World War strategists. His will be a mobile war, a rolling attack that never stops, spearheaded by motorized units. The idea runs counter to the thinking of all the generals of Europe. From a military standpoint, it's revolutionary, but it poses immense logistical problems. There are many myths about the French campaign. Research by military historian Karl-Heinz Friese has traced some of them back to their roots.
The Germans did something really crazy. Following General von Manstein's plan, they charged their tanks through the mountainous forests of the Ardennes and caught the Allies completely off guard. The second thing was, this was the first ever operational use of tanks. The Allies had over 4,200 tanks at their disposal, strung out along the entire front. But the Germans concentrated their 2,400 tanks mainly in the Ardennes, broke through there and caused a huge surprise.
The surprise attack is to come through South Belgium, where no one is expecting it. No one worries about infringing the neutrality of the Benelux countries. This is the famous sickle cut.
Manstein's sickle cut idea was so stunning. It sounded so crazy. It was like Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants. You would have thought it had sprung from the imagination of Jules Verne, not from the methodical, pedantic mind of a German general. And so the Allies were taken by surprise.
The weak point in Manstein's plan is that the sickle cut will expose a 100-kilometer flank to the Allies. It's a huge gamble.
The inventor of the Manstein plan became its first victim, for General von Manstein was relieved of his position, and the plan was declared too adventurous, simply crazy.
Army Chief of Staff Halder exiles Manstein to an unimportant post in the provinces, but Manstein still manages to present his plan to Hitler. The irony is that Hitler can't stand Manstein and doesn't grasp the full significance of his plan. Nevertheless, Manstein becomes the key creative mind for the invasion of France.
He naturally considered it his greatest achievement, and we at home knew that it was his idea. But he was, of course, not very happy that everyone else involved, including Hitler, were now claiming the credit. And that Hitler sold it as his own brilliant idea and deed.
After the fact, Hitler was celebrated by Nazi propaganda as the creator of the sickle cut. But truth be told, he didn't even really understand the idea.
Thus concentrated, the tanks are to push through northern France all the way to the Channel, with full aerial support and virtually without stopping. There hasn't been a campaign like it in all military history. General Guderian will lead the most important tank formations.
Confident of victory, on May the 9th we advanced to the border.
Walter Heinlein is a gunner in a panzer division under General Guderian. His upbringing has made him entirely ready for war against France.
Animosity towards the arch-enemy France was hammered into us over and over again. We said it was natural. We wanted to get back the regions we had lost in 1919. They always told us that in school too.
Neighbours are enemies, the spirit of the times. On May the 10th, 1940, the attack in the west begins. The rapid advance units of the Wehrmacht are to push forward through the Ardennes in southern Belgium. The countryside is so hilly and the roads so narrow, they're considered to be impassable for tanks. They take the risk. More than 40,000 vehicles have been prepared for the attack. As there are no supply depots along the way, fuel and provisions for hundreds of thousands of soldiers have to be brought along and made available at specific points. An exceptional feat of organization. But the terrain in the Ardennes keeps posing new problems. It seems the critics of Manstein's plan were right. The advancing columns of tanks and following infantry repeatedly clog the narrow mountain roads. They called it the biggest tailback in history.
Our tanks were just standing there. I was in the mechanized infantry, and we just sat in our vehicles. 7 men could sit in each one, and we sat there for hours, and we didn't go anywhere.
If spotted, these stationary vehicles would be an easy target for enemy air forces.
We were blocking the road so much with our vehicles and our tanks that they said, "Leave no distance between the vehicles, close up."
Eventually they succeed in unraveling the tailback. The Allies had not expected an attack through the Ardennes, so there are few casualties along the way. The element of surprise is crucial.
We advanced so fast. We saw a country house, and I was there. We went in, and there were English officers inside. They'd just finished breakfast. We couldn't understand it. They were so surprised by our advance. They didn't think it would happen so fast. Took them all prisoner.
The soldiers come to believe they're part of a modern, almost invincible army. It will turn out to be a dangerous illusion.
The balance of power of the Western Allies and the German Wehrmacht was clearly tilted in favor of the Western powers. They had considerably better tanks. German engineers had a lot of catching up to do. But in 1940, the Western Allies were superior in almost every area.
The few modern divisions the Wehrmacht possesses are deployed like the steel tip of a lance. Out of a total of 157 divisions, only 10 have tanks, and only 6 are fully motorized. Behind the tanks come the horse-drawn units, technologically unchanged since the Napoleonic Wars. The vast majority of soldiers march on foot. Most divisions are poorly equipped and insufficiently trained. Only about half the army is fully battle-ready. Yet the ideas behind the army are modern, especially the system known as mission command.
The German army was famous for giving the lower ranks leeway in carrying out orders. It wasn't you attack now, go with your people up the cliff here, break through the forest over there and attack the enemy at the top of the hill from the rear. But the company will attack the enemy there after on-site reconnaissance. Lieutenant so-and-so will lead the attack, and then he could choose the best position for the attack with information those behind the lines couldn't possibly know.
Thus, every individual has his task. At the same time, the responsibility of non-commissioned officers and ordinary soldiers is increased, in the moral sense too. The question of good and evil is posed to each and every individual. A bunker, near the town of Sedan in France, the next obstacle to the Wehrmacht south of the Ardennes. The valley of the Maas is like one gigantic fortress. The Germans had won an important victory here in 1870. Hitler wants the army to pause after taking Sedan. Yet in Manstein's plan, the Maas is just one point in the advance to the Channel, which is to continue without interruption. Conflicts in the Wehrmacht leadership have become inevitable. The attack on Sedan begins with a massive bombardment. The French put up desperate resistance, but the defenders are finally overwhelmed. Now Walter Heinlein finds out about the terrible side of war.
We came to the Maas, and then we realized the enemy was there too. Then we really came under fire. We had our first casualties. And then you get a little... You start thinking, what's going on? War isn't a cakewalk after all.
Heinlein's early enthusiasm soon evaporates.
Everyone is afraid. Anyone who says he isn't afraid is lying. Again and again, every day until the end of the war. Fear. That's just how people are. They're afraid.
The battles are intense but brief. The very next day, 60,000 men and 22,000 vehicles, including 850 tanks, cross the Maas near Sedan. Then, on May the 14th, the panzers break out of their bridgehead. Without waiting, they strike out towards the west, towards the Channel. General Guderian's tank corps is advancing against the express orders of his superiors and Hitler. According to Hitler's supposedly brilliant plan, the Blitzkrieg was to have stopped here. Through his own initiative, Guderian saves the campaign.
We were surprised by the rapid advance, and it was Guderian who set the example. Just straight ahead, without any concern for what was to right or left. Straight ahead. That was our motto throughout the entire war.
Guderian gets his way, and his tactics seem to succeed. A mid-level general of the Wehrmacht has shown up the commander-in-chief. It's very embarrassing for Hitler. 10 days later, the Wehrmacht is almost at the Channel. Manstein's plan calls for an encirclement of the Allied armies in Belgium, preventing their retreat through the port of Dunkirk. But then something extraordinary happens. Hitler orders the attack to halt. For 3 days, the panzers don't move. The generals feel like hunting dogs held back in the heat of the hunt. They watch their prey escaping. The order to stop before Dunkirk was a critical mistake. Many people still scratch their heads about it today. Did Hitler intentionally let the British escape across the Channel? The soldiers can't believe it.
We thought, why aren't we moving? We've everything we need. With our tanks, we can just throw the English into the sea. And we weren't allowed to. And then came the Luftwaffe. Of course, they bombed the ships, and of course, they missed most of them. Not everything went right. And then, unfortunately, a lot of the English troops escaped across the water.
From Dunkirk, the bulk of the Allied armies are evacuated across the Channel. 340,000 men. Only vehicles and heavy equipment are left behind.
Later, I learned the Führer gave an order that there was to be no shooting at the retreating British. The expeditionary force was to be allowed to reach the ships. We said, what nonsense! And our commander replied, well, the English, they're Vikings, that's a Germanic race. At that time, the insanity about race was everywhere.
There was no such order. The real reasons were different. To ensure the rapid success of the operation, the Army High Command had taken important decisions without consulting the Commander-in-Chief. Once again, Hitler felt ignored.
Hitler
didn't want to stop the tanks at Dunkirk at all. He wanted to stop the generals. At Dunkirk, for the first and last time, there was a revolt of the Army High Command against Hitler. A kind of power struggle, a showdown. And Hitler won. It was basically a revolt against him as military leader. And now he made an example and ordered, as a matter of principle, that the tanks must stop.
Hitler's ploy works. The generals have lost a crucial showdown. For him, that's more important than 340,000 of the enemy escaping. A short time later, France surrenders, and Hitler can once again play the role of brilliant victor, commander of genius. A large part of France is occupied by the Wehrmacht. In their euphoria, the soldiers are ignorant of the power struggle going on behind closed doors. Their feelings of invincibility seem fully justified. The few critical voices in the army are silenced. Victory comes at a high cost. 25,000 German and over 100,000 Allied soldiers have lost their lives. Thousands of civilians have been killed.
If you were there from the very beginning, and you survived, then you were very lucky indeed. The young people who died there, who did they die for? For what? They say for the Vaterland, but for whom?
An important shift has taken place in the power structure of the Reich. Now more than ever before, the Wehrmacht is at the mercy of the dictator's whim. The military leadership has become a passive tool in Hitler's hands. At Trent Park, the captured German generals wonder how it could have come to this.
No matter how hard I try, I just can't get into my head what it was that made us follow that maniac Hitler.
And how did it begin? The officers were so unpolitical, and they believed that the government was just as honest as they were. If it had been a democratic government, we never would have believed them. It was the national spirit. He wrapped himself in the cloak of national spirit, and he deceived us.
From a negative, from a criminal point of view, the Nazis did what they did extremely well, ontologically.
The clique around him, they are to blame. They all should have said to him, "My Führer," and now it's...
Perhaps he wouldn't let them say anything.
Then they should have resigned.
But no one did. Franz Halder stayed at his post until 1942. Then, following arguments with Hitler, he was dismissed. After the assassination attempt on the 20th of July 1944, he was arrested. Halder lived until 1972. At the end of the war, Heinrich Hussmann is a sergeant major. The terrible things he's seen help him to get over his belief in Hitler's ideology. Today, he's a deeply religious man. Johannes Blaskowitz is appointed to various senior posts and is highly decorated. In 1948, he takes his own life while on trial at the Nuremberg Military Tribunal. The reasons for his suicide are not known. Walter Heinlein was wounded 6 times. He was decorated and reached the rank of captain. After the war, he became a carpenter, later an architect and building contractor. Today, he still gives lectures about his war experiences. Erich von Manstein was further promoted, but in 1944 Hitler dismissed him. He refused to take part in resistance efforts. After the war, he became a consultant for the formation of the new German army. He died in 1973. Georg Pendel saw out the war in his Luftwaffe ground unit. At the end, he felt betrayed, but wiser. After the war, he became a policeman. Most of the Wehrmacht soldiers kept their enthusiasm for the commander-in-chief for a long time. But Hitler's blitzkrieg, as represented by Nazi propaganda, was a myth.
Hitler was never more popular than after the Western campaign. He was seen as a kind of new messiah who had performed a miracle, the miracle of 1940. They put it down to Hitler's genius, without knowing what really had happened behind the scenes.
In 1940, Hitler, his army, and many ordinary Germans are intoxicated by the victory in the West. The prestige of the Nazis is at its highest point. Hitler need no longer fear opposition from the army. The consequences of that will be seen the following year in the East, with the war against the Soviet Union.